Welcome to the 6th video in this tutorial series on building an e-commerce website using React, Redux, GraphQL, and Firebase. Now in this video tutorial, we're going to be implementing Redux into our application. Now before we get started, I want to encourage you guys to check out the official GitHub repository for this project. At the end of each one of these tutorials, I'm creating PRs and merging with masters so that whenever you guys want, you can come over to this repository, you can compare your code with mine, you can just browse around the project, or you can even clone it to your desktop and run it locally. This is a fantastic resource for you. I will be adding a direct link to this repository in the description of this video. Of course, I also want to encourage you guys to check out our official YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/simpletut, not only to see our other content, but of course we have an official playlist for this video series, which you can find, again, a direct link to in the description of this video. Alternatively, you can just browse our channel and find this playlist. One of the great things about React is that it has a one-way data flow. And what that means is that you can't pass props from a child component to its parent component. You can only pass props from a parent component to a child component. And this is good because it makes it easier for us as developers to debug issues. But that isn't always the case. Sometimes, depending on the scenario, what you're building in the area of your application, you may find that you're passing props down through several layers of components until eventually you can the component that you're trying to provide this prop to has access to it. And this is referred to within the React world and community in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's called tunneling, sometimes it's called drilling. But what it basically means is that you're passing props down through several layers of components until eventually you reach the one that you're trying to pass this prop to. And that can become quite difficult to manage, especially as your application grows and you begin working with more and more properties. And I can already show you an example of that in practice within our application. So within our current application, our header component is using our current user object, which contains the user object that is currently logged into our application. It's also the object we're using to determine the current user's auth status, so whether they're logged in or not. And the header component is using that to update the UI, to either show links to register or log into the application, or it's showing a different link if the user is logged in to log out of the application. I can show you that. So if I log into the application here, you'll see that I get a different link in my header, which is of course to log out of the application. Now let me show you this in the code. So if I come over to my text editor, you'll see that within the root of our application, which is app.js, we have this current user object, which is in our state. And eventually we're passing that down to our layout, and our layout is passing that to our page component. So again, this is our layout component here. We're passing the props to our header component, which is here. So we're actually passing props down through several layers of components here, just so that our header component can utilize this piece of state. So if I show you our header component here, we're getting that current user object from our props, and then we're using that to conditionally render an unordered list within this component itself. Now, this is exactly why you would want to use Redux, because it allows you to not only persist data within our application, but it also allows any component within our application to have access to state without having to pass props down from a parent component or anything like that. So now that you know exactly why we need Redux, let's implement it into our application and use it. The first thing that we need to do is install the new dependencies that we're going to be working with. So let's head over to our terminal window and install those dependencies, the ones that we need to install. So npm install are going to be Redux itself. We want to install React Redux, and we want to install some middleware that we're going to be using, which is the Redux logger. So let's just go ahead and install those and restart our application. Npm run start. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is come over to our source folder and create a new folder, which is going to contain all of our Redux code. So I'm going to call it Redux. And the first thing that I'm going to do is create my first reducer, which is going to be my user reducer. So I'm going to create a folder within the Redux folder called user. Within the user folder, I'm going to have my first file, which is going to be my user.types.js. And this is going to be quite simple. It's just going to be a const for user types, which is going to equal an object, and we're going to export default user types, and we're going to set this type to set current user, and it's going to equal a string of the same thing, which is set underscore current underscore user. And some of this code may make sense to you. If not, then just follow along. I'll try to explain it as I go. And certainly if you actually look at the code once I've written it, I think it will definitely make sense to you as things start to come together. So within my user folder, I'm going to create another file. This is going to be my user.reducer.js. This is going to be my actual reducer. And what I need to do is import my user types from that file, my types file, so user.types. And what I need to do first of all is create some kind of initial state. So I'm going to create some initial state, and it's going to have my current user object, but initially it's just going to equal null. Then I can actually create my reducer finally. So I'm going to have my const user reducer. It's going to equal a function which will accept some state, and we're going to pass it that initial state as default, but it's also going to accept an action. And then what we want to do is we want to have a switch function, and we're going to base that off of the action.type, because our action has to have a type. That's a requirement. By default, we simply want to return our state. However, we're going to have one case, which is going to be user types dot set current user. And if this matches, then we want to return an object with all of the current state, but we're going to set the current user to action.payload. We can save that. I'm going to add a semicolon here, and I'm going to export this. So export default user reducer. We can save that, and I've successfully created my first reducer. The next thing that we want to do is actually create our root reducer. And again, this is going to be within our Redux folder. So within our Redux folder, I'm going to have a new file, and I'm just going to call this my root reducer.js. And this is going to be a fairly straightforward file. All we need to do is import at the top here. So we're going to import from Redux. Here we go. We want to import combine reducers. And we're going to use this more as we build this application out. But for now, the only reducer we have is our user reducer. So we're going to import that from the file we just created. So user/user.reducer. And I'm just going to export default So export default combine reducers. We're going to call that as a function. We're going to pass it an object with our user reducer. So we're going to have user and our user reducer. Okay, so what I've done so far is I've created my first reducer, which is my user's reducer. But what I haven't done is actually utilize this anywhere within my application. Right now, these are just standalone files. We have a root reducer here, obviously that has a reducer. But we don't actually have a store. We're not passing that to our application. So you might wonder why I've done this first. Well, the reason is quite simple. Combine reducers expects at least one reducer, at least one piece of state. So I didn't want to actually try and initialize the store without actually configuring my root reducer first. Now that I've done that, I can actually create my store that I'm going to use within my application. So let's go ahead and do that. So within my Redux folder, I'm going to create a store. I'm going to call this create store.js. And again, this is going to be quite a simple file. So what we want to do is first of all import from Redux. We want to import create store and apply middlewares. And we also want to import our logger. This is the middleware that we want to use within our application. That's going to help us with development, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you a little bit later, but it's our Redux logger. We installed that at the same time that we installed Redux and React Redux. And finally, we want to actually import our root reducer. And again, we just finished creating that file. So the first thing we need to do is just define our middleware. So I'm actually going to export this individually too. So we're going to export const middlewares. It's going to equal an array of the middleware that we want to use. At the moment, that's only our logger. Now with that, we're ready to actually create our store. So I'm going to say export const store equals create store, which is a function that accepts our root reducer and the applies middleware function. And we're going to call that function and pass it our middlewares. So although this will have created our store and we've exported both of these constants, I'm going to add at the bottom of the file export default store, because it will just make it a little bit more convenient for me when I'm using this in my application. Okay, so that's our store done, and we're actually ready to use that. And where we're going to use that is actually in the root of our application, which is our index.js file. Now, within this file, we need to import two things. The first thing we need to import is from React Redux, and that is the provider. And the second thing we need to import is our store itself. We just created that. It's inside of our Redux folder, and it's create store. So the first thing that we need to do here is actually wrap our entire application with our provider. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Then all we need to do is just pass our store to our provider. And what the provider is going to do is it's actually going to make the Redux store available to our entire application, which is why we need to wrap our provider around our entire application. That's why we're coding it this way. Awesome. So at this point, we're actually ready to use this within our application. We've actually created and linked up our store. So if you remember, if we come over to the browser, I mentioned previously that I wanted to use this within our header, right? So let's actually update our code to utilize Redux and our store within our header rather than relying on it being passed down from a parent component. So within my components folder, let's go to the header component index.js. And as you can see, currently we're using the current user, which is coming from props. Now, interestingly enough, we don't actually have to change our component here at all, right? Because we're actually still going to get current user from props. It's just not going to be passed down from the parent component. We're going to be getting it from our Redux store. So I'm going to collapse the header for now, and I'm going to import something from React Redux, which is connect. And what connect is going to allow me to do is create a new const, which is map state to props, and we're going to get some state, and we're going to be able to pass that to our application. So what we want at the moment is this current user object. We're going to get that from state. So I'm going to say current user, and we need to basically get that from state. So there's a number of ways I can do this, but before I do it, I want to kind of slow down and try to explain what I'm doing here. So let's come back over to the Redux folder. Let's go to the user folder and look at the, let's look at our root reducer. So this is our state object, and currently we have the user object which is on our state. So let's first of all, let's actually destructure here from our state the user object. All right, so let's use that. But let's come back over now to our user reducer and see what we're actually going to have within the user object. Well, we have current user, and current user is what we actually want here. And by default, it will be null. But if there is a payload, then it will actually contain the user object. So let's come back over to our header component, and we can say dot current user. And this is going to provide our current user object. But we're not actually connected to the component yet. So we need to use this connect method, and we'll just wrap that. And the first thing we want to do is pass it map state to props. And again, we're not going to be dispatching any actions within our header component. So I'm just going to pass null here, and we can save that. And what I can do now is actually come back over to my app.js file, which is where we were originally passing this current user object to the parent component. We do not need to pass that anymore. So I'm going to remove this from all of my layout components. We don't need to pass that down anymore because we're getting that from our Redux store. So let's come back over to our web browser. You're going to see that if I refresh the page, we shouldn't be seeing any errors. But if I log in with Google, or if you're already logged in, so let me do that. I'm going to go ahead and log in now. You're going to see that although the functionality of my page, my application is not changed, it was redirected away, I'm not seeing the change in my header. And the reason is because the current user is actually coming from the store, and currently we're not updating the store when the user is logged in with the current user object, right? Because if we look at our code, which is here in our component did mount on app.js, we have our auth listener, which is what we use to actually update the state currently. But we're not actually dispatching an action here to actually update the state. We're still updating this local state within our application. So this is why we need to create our Redux action, and this is how we'll actually update the store rather than the state. So to do that, let's come back over to our Redux folder, and in the user folder I'm going to create another new file, which is going to be user.actions.js. And all a Redux action is an object with a type and a payload. And you can see that if you look at the reducer itself, which you can see here, all it is going to be using is this type and the payload, which is in this case the current user object. So what we want to do is within our action here, first of all, we want to import our user types. So user types from our user types, and then we can just say export const, and we want to create this set current user action, which is going to basically equal a function that will accept that current user object, and it will simply return, that function is going to return our object with type, which is going to be the user types.setCurrentUser, and it's going to have a payload key with the user object. Now, although I've created my setCurrentUser action that I can use to update the Redux store, I'm not using it within my app.js file. I'm still using the state of the component to store the current user. And I'm also using the current user object here for restricting access to certain routes. So in this case, I'm actually redirecting the user, if they're logged in, away from the registration and login pages because they're already logged in. They're a user because they're logged in, so that they don't need to see or access those pages. So what I need to do is I need to get the value of the current user from the Redux store because I'm using it within this component, and I also need to dispatch the action to update the store instead of updating the state when they are logging in. So let's actually handle that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import this set current user action that I just created within app.js. So I'm going to import that. So I'm going to import that from the file I created, which is Redux user actions. So it's set current user. But I can't use this directly. I need to dispatch it using Redux. And to do that, I need to import connect. So we're going to import that from React Redux. We're going to import connect. But obviously we need to, where we export our class here, we need to wrap it with connect. Like that. But this accepts two things, as I already demonstrated within the header component. The first is where we can map state to props. The second is dispatch. So we need to create both. We need to create map state to props, and we need to create map dispatch to props. And these can actually be called anything. It doesn't matter what you call them. But this is pretty much industry standard. So we haven't actually created this at all. We've just tried to use it, which would error. So we're going to create, first of all, map state to props. And this obviously will receive state. We're going to destructure again, as we did on header, user, the user state. And again, this is going to return an object with the current user, which is just going to be user.currentUser. Secondly, we need to handle dispatch. So I'm going to say const map dispatch to props. And again, this is going to take dispatch. Like so. And what it's going to do is return our set current user And what we want to do is we're going to get the user object, which is the current user, and we want to dispatch our action, which is going to be our set current user action that we imported up here. And we're just going to pass it our user. And again, this is going to be used in our payload. So that is all we need to do. But we do need to update our application a little bit. So currently, we're trying to get the current user from state. It's now going to be coming from props. Otherwise, the rest of the code in the return function remains the same. What we do need to tweak a little bit is how we actually update the state, because we don't need to update state anymore. We need to update the store. So to do that, we don't need this constructor anymore. We also don't need any initial state here. This is all handled by Redux and our user reducer. And also here, rather than using this.setState, we simply say this.props.setCurrentUser, and we can call that directly, but we also don't need this current user object. We can just return this object directly. So let's go ahead and do that. And the same thing is we can do here when the user is logged out. Rather than passing this initial state, we can just say this.props.setCurrentUser and pass it we can actually just pass it our user auth object here, because that will by default return null anyway if the user is not logged in. So because we're actually using this in two places, I'm going to actually just destructure it from props up at the top. So I'm just going to say this.props will sort of grab set current user. And that means that rather than saying this.props, we can just say set current user in both places. And that is all we need to do. So cool. Now let's come back over to our browser and just reload the page a couple of times. So I'm actually currently logged in, and you can see that it says log out. So you can actually see already that it's working, but let's log out. And you can see I'm able to browse the pages correctly. And let's go to sign in. Let's sign in. And let's click on my account, log in. And as you can see, I'm redirected to the home page, and I still see log out. So it's, again, we've restored the same functionality, the same logic, but rather than using state within our application, we're using our Redux store. And again, if I now come back over to my DevTools and I perform some kind of an event like logout, you can see, because we're using our middleware, which you can also see from Redux and Create Store, we're using our logger middleware. Because I'm using that middleware, this is a really great feature because it actually shows me the events that take place within my Redux store. And this is something that we're going to look at a little bit more later on in this video series. But for now, I just want to make you aware of it because it actually shows the action that's dispatched and the changes to the store as and when they occur. Thank you for watching this video tutorial. As always, I'm going to head over to my terminal window and I'm going to check in the code. And after I sign off on this video tutorial, I'm going to be merging this with master. And of course, following this video tutorial, I'm going to be merging this with master. Of course, if you want to take a look at the code I've been writing, then just simply head over to this repository and compare your code with mine. But of course, as always, thank you for following this video tutorial. I look forward to the next video where we're going to be looking at user roles. That's basically where you can restrict access to different user levels, for example, an admin versus a normal user. But of course, that's for the next video. But of course, for now, I'd really appreciate it if you guys can, of course, subscribe to the channel, like, comment,